Hello and welcome to the Topic 3 Lecture 2. And in this topic lecture, we're going to be talking about tools to measure crime. So your textbook talks about 4 different tools for measuring crime, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about 2 of them. The 4 tools that they talk about in your textbook is the Uniform Crime Reports, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, National Crime Victimization Survey, and self-report surveys. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the Uniform Crime Reports and the National Crime Victimization Survey. Okay, so let's take a look at the Uniform Crime Report, or also known as the UCR. So the Uniform Crime Report is issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and it's probably the best known and most widely cited source of criminal statistics. The Uniform Crime Report is based on the reports that local police departments make to the FBI. So it's based on the monthly reports of over 17,000 police departments. And what's contained in these reports are the crimes that are reported to local law enforcement departments and also the number of arrests that are made by the police agency. The UCR reports what's known as cleared crimes. And so not just the crimes that have been reported to police, but they also talk about whether or not a crime has been cleared. And what it means for a crime to be cleared is that when at least one person is arrested, charged, and then turned over to the courts, okay? And so basically, it's identifying somebody as being responsible for committing a crime, right? Because they get charged with the crime. Now, whether they're found guilty or not, or what happens after that, that wouldn't be included in the reporting of a cleared crime. Now, as we know from reading in your textbook that we have a relatively low clearance rate in the United States. And so of all the Part 1 crimes that are committed, that about 20% of those crimes are cleared. In other words, about 20% of those crimes, a person is identified, arrested, and charged for that crime. So relatively low clearance rate. Now there's a higher clearance rate for violent crimes, and that would make sense because police departments put a lot more resources behind finding out who perpetrated a violent crime as compared to a property crime. Okay, so this table from the Pew Research Foundation shows a comparison between the types of crimes that are most likely to be reported to police and the types of crimes that are most likely to be cleared by the police. Now, in a little bit, we're going to be talking about the National Crime Victimization Survey that is conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And right now, we're talking about the Uniform Crime Report that is based on FBI statistics. In this graph, in the top portion here, okay, in this portion, this is information that comes from a combination of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Crime Victimization Report, and UCR. Because the National Crime Victimization Survey is about, have you been a victim of crime? And so that's how we have a good idea about whether or not a crime has been reported to police, because we look at who says they're a victim of crime and we compare that to whether or not that shows up as a reported crime in the UCR. But in that top graph here, we see that the dark color is crime victimizations or violent crime victimizations, and the other is the light tan is property victimizations. And you can see, as that top line says, that auto thefts are most likely to be reported, which makes sense because your car was stolen. And then violent crimes are more likely to be reported to police. But with property crimes, personal theft, larceny, household theft, less likely to be reported to police. Do note, though, that rape and sexual assault, which is considered a violent offense, also has a low reporting rate. And that would make sense given the personal nature of that crime, and also a sense of that maybe you don't want to report it because you might not have a lot of faith in the police's ability to solve that crime, and you also just might not want to go through the trauma of having to relive that crime as you report it to police, and if it goes from there. In the second graph here, it shows that the number of reported crimes that are cleared by police. And you see that violent crimes in dark green have a much higher rate, as we mentioned in the last slide, of being cleared, while property crimes have less of a rate of being cleared. And, that's because violent crimes that law enforcement are going to put more resources behind solving those crimes. And also, usually with violent crimes, there's going to be more evidence, blood, forensic evidence that the law enforcement eyewitnesses potentially in a robbery and those sorts of things. So more likely that there's going to be more evidence to make it easier to identify who perpetrated that crime. In property crimes, less focus on solving those, and also just less evidence too that the police have to work with trying to figure out who perpetrated that crime. Okay, as we're going to see with all the tools that your textbook talks about and the tools used to measure crime, there are going to be problems with those tools, and that's just normal and to be expected. And so your textbook talks about factors that could affect the validity or the reliableness of these different tools. So let's take a look at the factors that affect the validity of the uniform crime reports. One factor to keep in mind is the reporting practices. So as we all know, not all crimes are reported to the police. In fact, as we looked at the National Crime Victimization Survey, that it seems as if less than 40% of crimes are actually ever reported to police. And so that means that the only crimes that get published in the UCR are crimes that are actually reported to police. And so that could mean that the UCR actually underestimates the amount of crime that's going on in the United States. Another thing to keep in mind is the law enforcement practices and methodological issues that are in the UCR. Keep in mind that not all law enforcement agencies participate in the UCR. These reports are voluntary, they're not mandatory. So some law enforcement agencies do not participate in this. Also, the reports can vary in accuracy. For example, there could be some variation in how a crime is interpreted by law enforcement. In one police department, a crime that could be reported as an assault, or aggravated assault, or it could be reported as attempted rape. And so that sometimes just the definition of what's aggravated assault versus what's attempted rape, those differences could be sort of blurry, and a police agency could decide whether or not they want to categorize this act as aggravated assault or attempted rape. That, as your textbook points out, if there are multiple crimes that take place, only the most serious crime is reported to the UCR. And so if there's a homicide, and then a burglary, and then some sort of simple assault, only the homicide will be reported in the UCR. And then finally, federal crimes aren't reported in the UCR, but they are reported in a separate report. And the vast majority of crimes that are committed in the United States, though, are not federal crimes. The vast majority of crimes are state crimes. And so that, just keep that in mind, that yes, federal crimes aren't reported, but federal crimes make up a fairly small percentage of the amount of crime that goes on in the United States. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about with the Uniform Crime Report are the three methods that the Uniform Crime Report uses to express crime data. And this isn't unique to the Uniform Crime Report. The National Crime Victimization Survey, as well as other tools for reporting crime, will use these same sorts of methods. So one thing that the Uniform Crime Report does is it will just report the raw number of crimes that took place in the United States. So it gives you a raw figure. So for example, that the number of, so the raw figure is the number of actual crimes that have been reported to police. So for example, in 2017, 319,356 robberies were reported to police in the United States. And so that's the raw figure. Now, the thing about the raw figure is we don't really know what it means, right? I mean, wow, that sounds like a lot of robberies. But out of how much of a population? Now, if the population of the United States was 1 million people, that would mean that, nearly 1 out of every 3 people in the United States were victims of robbery. But if the population of the United States is 350 million people, that means a lot less people are subject to robbery in the United States. And so crime rates is a way that we can sort of get a better sense of just how significant are those crimes, the number of crimes, how significant are they to the total population. And so crime rates will tell you a rate per 100,000. So it'll take the number of reported crimes, and if you want to know the U.S. crime rate, you would take the number of reported crimes, you would divide it by the total U.S. population, and then you would multiply that by 100,000. And so since there are a lot of people that live in the United States, it's not that the crime rate that seems like a lot of robberies, but it's for every 100,000 inhabitants, 98 are victims of crime. Now, we're not saying if that's a good rate or a bad rate, but it just gives you more information about figuring out just how significant that crime, how significant a problem that crime presents to society. And then the Uniform Crime Report will compute changes over time. And so it tells us whether or not the crime has increased or decreased over time. And so, for example, there had been a 20% decrease in robberies from 2008 to 2017. And so it'll report changes over time. The next tool we're going to talk about is the National Crime Victimization Survey, or the NCVS. The NCVS is sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is a part of the United States Department of Justice, just as the FBI is also a part of the United States the United States Department of Justice. But the National Crime Victimization Survey is a very different way for measuring crime. As we know, the UCR is based on the reports that local law enforcement make to the FBI, and the NCVS is, as its name suggests, it's a survey of households in the United States. And it's a really large survey. So more than 42,000 households are surveyed in the United States each year. And that includes about 78,000 people, including the ages of individuals 12 years old and up. Like any good survey, it's a representative sample of the United States population. The people are randomly selected to participate in the survey. The households stay in the survey for 3 years, and they are interviewed 2 times a year as a household. And that, the questions that are asked on the National Crime Victimization Survey is they ask you whether you've been a victim of crime, right? And so it is not, did you report this crime to the police, but have you been a victim? Did you experience, was some sort of criminal activity perpetrated upon you in the last year or in the last 6 months? And as we know that certain crimes reported in the National Crime Victimization are found to go unreported in the UCR, in particular rape and sexual assault, but other crimes as well. Okay, just as there were factors affecting the validity of the Uniform Crime Report, there are also factors that affect the validity of the National Crime Victimization Survey. So one factor is the possibility of overreporting due to victim misperception. That you could think that your wallet has gone missing. Maybe you left it in your car, and you think, boy, I went in my car the next day and my wallet was gone. It must have been stolen. And so you would report stolen wallet. I've been a victim of theft in the National Crime Victimization Survey. However, maybe a couple weeks later, after you give your survey response, you're like, ooh, I found my wallet. It was underneath my bed. I didn't leave it in the car. It wasn't stolen. It was just misplaced. And so that can happen, that crimes, victimizations can be reported in the survey that were in fact not victimizations at all. Obviously, that you're going to have underreporting due to embarrassment. And so a 13-year-old is, unlikely to report child abuse to the survey respondents just due to embarrassment or the fact that they're taking that survey with their family. Same with rape. You just may not ever want to report that to police, or you might not want to report it in the survey due to embarrassment. And as with any survey, you must be aware of sampling error. This is a survey. Is the group representative of the United States? Is the group randomly selected? If you're doing a survey and you cherry pick who you want to be in that survey, that's not going to be a good survey. And so you have to make sure that your sample is in fact random and representative. Still, even though there are factors affecting the validity of the National Crime Victimization Survey, most social scientists find the NCVS to be a very, very valid tool for measuring crime. So, how much crime is actually going on in the United States? Well, if you listen to some elected officials, it would be easy to conclude that crime is worse than it's ever been. Well, the question is it? Is crime worse than it's ever been? Is the crime rate out of control? The perception is that most people have in the United States is yes, that the vast majority of people, when asked a question, is crime worse this year compared to last year, the vast majority of people say that it's either getting worse, that there's more crime, or crime is staying about the same. However, the reality is that all types of crime have been on the decline in the United States since 1993. We did see some upticks in crime in 2016, but it returned to it from 2016 to 2017, but it returned to a downward trend. And as you're going to be reading this week in the article, that the pandemic year of 2020 and 2021, while general crime is on the decline, it continues on a decline, including property crime is on the decline. Certain kinds of crimes, we've seen a really quite significant uptick, and that is the rise in homicides. And you're going to be reading an article this week that is exploring, yes, there is a rise in homicides, and what are some factors that might be influencing that rise. We don't know whether it's going to be a long-term trend, but that is something that we've seen in the last year. Now, this is an interesting graph because it shows, let me put my magic pen on here. It shows the relationship between perception and reality. And so in this green line here, this is based on Gallup polling, where they ask you, compared, when you think about this year compared to last year, is there more crime in the United States? And that you see from 1992 to 2000, that the perceptions about that there's more crime in the United States have actually went down. People were saying, you know what, there is not, less people are saying that there's more crime in the United States from the year before. And that trended, pretty closely with the decline in the violent crime victimization rate, right? So crime was actually going down, and people's perception of crime, that they said, yeah, it does seem like maybe there's not as much crime. But in 2000, we see that a gap develops. And so that while the rate of victimization, of violent victimization goes down, continues that downward trend, that the perception that crime is getting worse and worse and worse continues to go up. And I know that this is ends in 2015, this data, but recent data from 2015 forward shows that that this perception that crime continues to get worse, that remains the case. From year to year, people still have this perception that crime, at least nationwide, is getting worse and worse. So perception is that crime keeps getting worse and worse, but what's the reality? Well, as it says there, that U.S. violent, this is from the Pew Research Center, and it says that U.S. violent and property crime rates have plunged since the 1990s, regardless of the data source. So regardless of whether you're looking at the UCR or whether you're looking at the National Crime Victimization Survey. And so let me put my magic pen on here again. You'll see that the violent crimes per 100,000 people from the FBI, that's the Uniform Crime Report, has decreased since the 1990s. Violent victimization, this is from the National Crime Victimization Survey. Reports of being a victim of violent crime have gone down. Property crime, UCR, has gone down. And that victimization of household property crimes are reported as going down as well. And so the reality is that we continue to see a downward trend when it comes to violent crime and property crime in the United States. So, what about 2020 and 2021? And what does it tell us about the future of crime in the United States? Well, we never want to draw conclusions from 1 or 2 years. As criminologists like to look at long-term trends. So, we're not exactly sure what 2020 violent and 2021 violent crime statistics are telling us about the future in the United States. But it's no doubt that those 2 years have been really weird in terms of mostly due to the pandemic. As you're going to be reading this week, property crimes are on the decline quite significantly, but serious crimes like murders and shootings have been on the increase. So there have been a significant uptick in homicides both in 2020, and it seems like it's persisting into 2021 as well. But general violent crime rates are not ticking up. Why is that? Well, you're going to be reading 2 articles that dig into that a lot more deeply, and there will be quiz questions on both of these articles. One is The Trouble with Crime Statistics from the New Yorker, which really talks about some of the challenges we face in trying to measure crime in the United States. And the others are Murders Are Up, Crime Is Not, What Is Going On by German Lopez from Vox. So make sure that you read them, not only because there's quiz questions on them, but because they're really interesting articles as well. So let's return and end with thinking about the gap between the reality of crime in the United States and the misperception of how much crime is going on in the United States. If I had asked you on day 1 of this class, before you had opened the textbook or listened to any of the lectures, and I asked you, is crime going up, going down, or staying the same? So if I asked you, think about this year and compare it to last year, and you think that this year compared to last year, do you think that crime is going up, going down, staying the same? How would you have answered or responded to that question? When you think about your perceptions or misperceptions of crime, what shapes those perceptions? Personal experience, reporting that you see on the news, crime shows that you watch, like what influences your perception of crime in the United States? And is this gap between perception and reality a cause for concern? We live in a society where people, vote what their concerns are. And if people think that there's a lot of crime going on in the United States, they might support really more get tough on crime sort of legislation, keep people locked up and those sorts of things. But if the reality is that crime's on the decline, right, then people might be voting based on a perception that's actually not in line with reality. So is it a cause for concern? Why or why not? And what potential impact does the perception of crime have on politics and policies in the United States? And when we read our book and write your paper on Locked In, the author of that book really sort of digs into talking about the way that perception of crime, the impact that has on public policy. All right, thanks for listening. I appreciate your time, and I'll talk to you again soon.